As promised, Nickel started teaching Andrias how to wield a sword properly. As Andrias was swinging his sword, he noticed his body was creaking like crazy. He couldn't help but admire Nickel for teaching him how to keep up with a body like that. While training, he started to wonder how it is like having a crazy aura master as a teacher. Under the guidance of Nickel, he will be able to use aura much faster than he imagined. And in the future, he will be able to switch between aura and mana, as he won't need to choose just one since it has dual core trait. With all of these things in mind, he was certain that he will be able to walk the path of a magic swordsman since he will be using both the mana in his heart and Dantian. It will not be so easy for him to grow. But with such strong determination and help of Nickel, who is an aura master, will surely get past the initial stages, becoming stronger than anyone. Just like the great Emperor Edmund, the one who founded the empire with the help of his dual core trait. Suddenly, Nickel pinched Andrias back to reality. He was surprised and asked why Nickel did that. Nickel, with a strict attitude, pointed out that Andrias needed to focus on his training. Andrias was puzzled as to how a grip of a pile of bones be so strong. As Nickel was consoling Andrias, our MC thought, being a former member of the Special Forces, physical training will be a breeze for him, claiming he will teach a lesson or two about guts to Andrias. But as he wondered, Nickel pinched him again, making him furious, so he dared Nickel to pinch him one more time. After finishing his training session, as he was enjoying a cup of tea, he wondered how much his necromancy had leveled up since he skipped class and let Nickel out. So he opened the system window, and to his surprise, he had increased about 2 points in just 5 hours, which was a lot faster than he thought, considering that after reaching beginner grade, the leveling up should have been a lot slower. He suddenly remembered that Sharon hadn't called him for a while. Since the vampire looked the same, he was certain that Sharon hadn't found out. Given that it was taking a lot of time for the evolution to finish, Andrias was positive that nothing probably went wrong. Suddenly, his thoughts were disrupted by Nickel swinging his sword. As Andrias was watching Nickel train rigorously, he stated that even though Nickel was an undead and never got tired, his sheer determination to hone his swordsmanship impressed Andrias, giving him an idea to use potions so he could also train like Nickel, endlessly healing himself forever. There are 2 types of healing potions. One is a healing potion that heals internal injuries and fatigue, whereas the other is a regenerating potion that heals external wounds and amplifies one's recovery rate. Since these potions are expensive, there was no way Andrias could afford them. However, Andrias thought if he could make them himself, he could probably spend less on the cost of making them. But it's not as easy as in the game. Andrias knew the necessary ingredients, but didn't know the specific ratio. So he thought it would be better for him to attend some of the classes to fill up his knowledge in potion making. According to his plan, he went to the academy to attend some potion classes. As he opened the door, he caught the attention of the students who were already there. The students started to whisper among themselves as to why Andrias had come to the potion class. In response to that, another student replied by saying it was probably to pick up girls. Some were talking about how even after his family has already been ruined, they were surprised too as why he was even taking the classes. Andrias could hear all of them whispering, but he decided to endure it as he was not there to stand out at all. As he was taking the stairs to his seat, another playable character from the game caught his attention. It was Lucia Everlast, who was a prodigy in potion making. Silence. Let's start the 3rd lecture, said the professor. This is Professor Vauban, who teaches intermediary medicinal herbalism. As Andrias was attending the lecture, he analyzed that the contents and events hadn't strayed from the game so far. He wished for the professor to start the part about the mixing rates. The professor started talking about the method for making physical reinforcement potion. He then stated that the potion making is based on mohine leaves and 3 other materials. Andrias suddenly realized the contents of the lecture, and his game knowledge wasn't matching. So he thought, even though it's an intermediary potion, they were being taught a potion with so many side effects. Without hesitation, he stood up and asked for permission to ask a question. After getting permission from the professor, Andrias asked why he didn't add Hong Pishi extract and Matarata root bark, which made the professor startle along with the students in the classroom, making everyone stare at him with amusement. However, Professor didn't like how Andrias doubted his teaching, and instead of providing a meaningful answer, he mocked Andrias, asking why he should add those in. He didn't stop there and continued mocking him, saying if he wants to add those ingredients, then he should just go ahead and make a soup, making everyone burst into laughter. Andrias was puzzled with their reactions, as what he said were all the necessary ingredients to make a physical reinforcement potion. So he thought the reason for this could be that the recipe hadn't been discovered yet. As the class ended and everyone started to leave, Andrias thought to himself that even though he went through all the trouble of attending the class, his knowledge was way better than what he had just learned from the class. So he cursed himself for expecting anything in the first place that made him decide it would be better for him to study alone. As Andrias started to leave with disappointment, Lucia was staring at Andrias in confusion as to how a senior she had never seen before knew the most effective ingredients to the physical reinforcement potion. This is the research department on the academy ground where Andrias is trying to make potions. A notification window popped up before him which stated the potion brewing had failed. Andrias was frustrated with the constant failure. He took a break and leaned back on his chair thinking even though he knew the recipe, what he needed right now was a reliable way to make potions. Also, the materials cost a lot more than he thought, which would make him go broke soon. Then he wondered if someone would help him, but dismissed the thought as there was no way anyone would help a trashy person like Andrias. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Lucia leaned forward. As she expected, Andrias was there. Then, she started to walk towards him. Andrias was bewildered as to why a playable character would come here. And on top of that, it was none other than Lucia Everlast, the one playable character who's a genius at potion brewing. In the game, she wasn't so close to Andrias, so he was surprised to find her there. Lucia, then waving her hand to clear the smoke, exclaimed that it seemed like Andrias had been failing a lot. Andrias thought if he left her be and ignored her, then maybe she would leave on her own. Lucia, being a curious person, she leaned towards Andrias, asking what he was experimenting on. Andrias, with a slight look of annoyance, replied it was a secret and further wondered on his own as to how even though he went to class, got nothing out of it, and yet his problems just kept on increasing. Meanwhile, Lucia kept on staring intently towards Andrias, wondering how he could just ignore her. Lucia then exhaled and said that Andrias was really bitter, while Andrias just wanted her to leave. Lucia proceeded to say that she expected someone like Andrias would not propose anything first. She further leaned towards Andrias, calling him senior in a persuasive voice, asking him to study with her. She further tried to convince him, asking him if he thinks it's a good idea. As curious as he was, he realized that refusing might not be necessary, but still he was doubtful of her intention and asked her what she wanted. She responded asking if it is weird for her to want a research partner. He was not satisfied with her answer as she would not gain anything out of this. She would be grateful to have a research partner like him. She was impressed by his knowledge in the class. It seemed to her that Andrias had some kind of talent, could create some amazing things. Her main goal was to make medicines that didn't yet exist in the world. He was surprised by her statement and started to wonder how he was just trying to make medicine for himself. The reason Lucia is so well versed in potions isn't just because she had talent for it. It was because if she didn't find a way to heal the disease she had, then she would eventually die because of it. Since even famous doctors and pharmacists couldn't heal her, she had no choice but to study it all by herself. The disease she had was a grave one, which was granted by the system itself. But if someone is not like Andrias, who has played the game a ton, they wouldn't be able to find the cure. Even though Andrias knows the ingredients needed for the cure, he doesn't know the exact ratio. What are the chances for him to meet someone as intelligent as her who could teach him better than the professors? Even though she would be a very useful ally, the last thing that he needed was someone finding his real identity. This is why he was very cautious in accepting her proposal. Seeing him lost in his own thoughts, she asked why he had an irritated expression. He concluded her meeting him because of what she heard him say in class. Thinking how his life will just get shorter if he carelessly got himself tangled with her, he rejected her saying he's not interested and told her to leave. Peona Mushroom, said Lucia, which made Andrias amazed. Lucia knew Andrias left the final ingredient purposely and sarcastically whispered how he didn't mention the final ingredient in class but still was needed to make the potion complete. Andrias wondered how she knew about this as nobody should know about the main material but him. She pointed at the potion claiming if he added the ingredient there, then he would be able to make the potion. She further said that she knew about it intuitively. If Andrias wished for it to happen, she could help him with it and perhaps even make him some money. Andrias, still refusing her offer, said she was just saying that because she was rich. He was not yet ready to give his life just because of her attractive proposal, so he told her to leave after she was done with what she came to do. Lucia knew Andrias would change his mind soon, so she started to leave the room while winking at him, saying she'll give him some time to think about it. As she left, he glanced at the door and said he didn't need to think about it. As he went back to his dormitory, It was time for his training. Nickel was training as enthusiastically as always. However, Andrias just like always started to zone out. He was wondering about the things that Lucia said and thought even though he wouldn't be worrying about anything, the risks were too high. He was confident he could find the ratios himself, but the main problem was money. As he suspected, he needed a way to make money first. As he swung his wooden stick fiercely, he wondered if any good idea would come into mind. His chain of thought was interrupted by a sudden swing close to him by Nickel. Andrias was startled as to how Nickel always knew when he was not focusing. Concluding he'll have more time to think about it carefully after the training ends, he decided to focus more on his training for now. Then he received a letter from his sister saying that she missed him, which gave him an idea to ask his sister for money. So he made up his mind to go meet his sister. But that was the exact same thing that the previous Andrias did. However, RMC was ashamed he had to do this as it was the only viable option. As he was on his way to his sister, he thought that no matter how much of a scumbag the previous Andrias was, this was not a way to make money. And he swore to himself that this would be the last time he will be doing this. Suddenly, he caught someone's attention. A mysterious girl who seemed to know Andrias as well was surprised to see him walking around carrying a book. She questioned herself if he finally managed to get the determination to do something. Knowing him in person, she was confident even if he changed, there was no way to fix his trashy personality. Even though he had already noticed the girl, he pretended as if he hadn't seen her and walked away calmly. In the back of his mind, he knew she was none other than Diane Alvin herself, the genius magician and young lady of the Alvin family. She was another playable character who could kill him easily in the academy. He clearly remembered that they used to get along pretty well when they were kids. But they eventually grew apart because the Cromwell family had lots of debt to pay. The previous Andrias had done some pretty bad things back then, so he thought to himself that Diane would probably kill him just by him talking to her. But either way, him dying wouldn't be weird at all, as there were many characters who could kill him at his current level. As he walked away from Diane, he was convinced that asking his younger sister for money would be the best option at the very moment. Soon, he reached Capital Rodlin. As he faintly remembered his sister's workplace, he was searching for it around the capital. Finally, he reached the place and met his sister. His sister welcomed Andrias but was so furious that she didn't receive any answer even after sending so many letters. She was shouting so loud, the customers could also hear her from outside. Andrias calmly apologized to her for making her work, even though she is a lady of a count's household. She was shocked and pleased to witness this side of Andrias, as it was not something that Andrias could have ever said. Then, she gently told that he wasn't responsible for it. And this is Amy Cromwell, Andrias's younger sister, a gentle and hard-working soul who loved her brother immensely and was always there for him. As he nervously held his cup, her sister, knowing that he was there for more money, blushed at him, questioning the serious face he was making. She, being a loving sister, had already prepared some money for him but warned him not to spend it carelessly. While he was taking the envelope, he thanked her for it and promised to pay her back. Suddenly, Amy was in a state of shock. She noticed Andrias wasn't wearing the ring, and when asked about it, he nervously replied that he took off the engraved ring so he wouldn't lose it. Amy, trying to believe Andrias, asked whether he was taking good care of it or not. Judging by the looks of Amy, he thought that he can't tell her the truth. Seeing Andrias's silence scared Amy. This made her ask, "You didn't do it, did you?" As Andrias continued to be silent, Amy realized that he had already sold the ring. With disappointment in her face, she told him no matter what he shouldn't have done that. Andrias, with guilt of what he had done, apologized to Amy. Disappointed with Andrias's actions, she furiously got up, banging the table, scolding him to get out and that she did not want to see him anymore. She turned around and started to leave the room crying. Andrias tried to stop her, but without listening to him, she ran out of the room screaming not to come here and that he didn't have to pay her back anymore. Andrias, with a sense of realization, yelled that he would get the ring back. From this reaction of Amy, he realized that the ring must have been a really important item for her. After all, it was his first time seeing Amy so angry. A sense of despair ran over Andrias, which made him feel miserable, like he had never felt before. Strengthening his resolve, he promised to himself that he would get the ring back as soon as possible, because what meaning is there in life when one's simply existing? As he reminisces about his past life, in which he wasn't happy when he was surviving alone. With a calm look and a sense of confidence, he made up his mind to make the best of what he got and reconsidered to accept Lucia's proposal. Andrias accepted her offer. As they started to work together, a week went by. All of a sudden one morning, Andrias went to Lucia to wake her up and motivate her to get up and run a little, as she had stayed like an ET inside her room for a whole week. As Andrias was pushing himself, Lucia was lazing around as usual. Sleeping on the bench, she tried to encourage him by saying he could do it, stupid senior. As days went by, they continued their research together. They made time apart from their classes to do experiments. Andrias knew his body was weak. He was determined to get stronger through consistent and rigorous training. However, Lucia, being the lazy one, continued to sleep while Andrias was training. It was very tiresome for Andrias to use his spare time to train and do experiments, but sometimes Lucia switches up and helps in making things go faster. But most of the time, she is just sleeping. One evening, as Andrias continued his experiments, he called Lucia asking why it felt like he was the only one working. She quickly denied his accusation, saying he was just imagining things further, demanding a candy. Her constant laziness annoyed him. As Andrias was saying instead of doing nothing, Lucia interrupted him, suggesting to decrease the amount of Matarata and increase the amount of Todor's tree essence. Without a doubt, he accepted her suggestion. As he was following her instructions, he thought how her intuition is really precise, getting right into the heart of the problem. He knew he was doing this just because of the money, but working together really was the best answer. As he mixed all the ingredients and poured the extract into another container, the mixture in the container started to glow. Then he took a small dose of the mixture and poured a few drops into the potion. As soon as the mixture touched the potion, a sudden system notification popped up in front of Andrias, which startled him. The potion was a success. They had manufactured a physical reinforcement potion of an intermediary grade. Andrias stood in excitement. Lucia was surprised by his sudden action and asked if he had failed again. With a sense of joy and accomplishment, Andrias turned towards Lucia, claiming that it had finally worked. Another notification popped up stating that the talent potion brewing, which was a buff type, an ordinary grade 1, had been acquired. The conditions had been met. He was surprised he got a new talent. Another notification popped up indicating evolution of the new talent was possible. The probability of buff type potion brewing was 32%. He didn't have any idea what this meant. Reminiscing back to the time when he evolved the vampire, he figured out that he could evolve traits as well. He questioned himself if this meant he could basically evolve anything if the conditions were fulfilled. However, he wasn't satisfied with 32% probability value, as it was even lower than the time when he evolved the vampire. He decided to save it for now and focus on the potion. Lucia was amazed by this incredible potion, which had basically no side effects and could also be used on a daily basis. She then suggested going and making a request to the potion examination committee right away. Andrias calmly replied that she could do that part since he had basically done all the work so far. Lucia, jumping in excitement, said she was going to be busy with her midterms, which was starting tomorrow. As their midterm examinations were starting tomorrow, they were both going to be busy, but since Andrias had made it easier for Lucia, she decided to take care of it. Andrias was annoyed as he found out she was purposely slacking off. In the meantime, the scene shifts towards the vampire laying in the cells. The remaining time for the evolution of Angela Lucifer was 14 days, 21 hours, and 33 minutes. She asked herself what the hell she had done as her whole body was burning and in terrible pain, but she continued to endure the pain as she felt like there was something more to this pain. As Andrias was in the train that was heading towards the midterms evaluation spot, an instructor told the students to gather together so that they could explain how the evaluation was going to work. Knowing Lucia, Andrias, holding a book in his hand, thought she could easily pass the first examination. After that, the last part of the examination takes place in the magic tower. Andrias was well prepared as he had done a lot of training with Nickel, which made his swordsmanship and necromancy level increase considerably. Andrias thought he would be fine as long as he could manage to pass the midterms. As he wondered, he remembered and got excited to check up on the vampire as the evolution was about to finish. He planned that once he completes the evaluation, he would go back and give an excuse which probably would give him the opportunity to check on the vampire. Meanwhile, two girls sat opposite Andrias and started whispering among themselves. One of them called the other girl with her name Diane. She was none other than Diane Alvin, the genius magician Andrias had encountered a few weeks earlier. The other girl asked Diane what she thought the midterms would be about this time, as every year the evaluation process would be changed. Startled by the sudden question, Dean looked at the other girl and asked what she meant. The other girl started to explain that the requests and group members would be given at random, and if one was lucky, it could be a breeze. Diane, being a model student, was not pleased by this explanation, so she said that no matter who she got paired up with, it would not matter, as she would easily clear this evaluation. But leaning in towards Diane, the other girl whispers that it would not be so simple. Pointing toward Andrias, the other girl asked Diane, what if she got in the same team as him? Unbothered by the whispers, Andrias started to put the book in his bag. The efforts of his rigorous training could be seen on his body, as he has gained significant muscle mass and now looked like a warrior. Diane was puzzled with the question and was in a state of confusion, looking at Andrias. Then one of the professors on board the train told everyone to get ready, as they would be arriving at the Orkland training station. Soon the train reached its station, and the professor told everyone to get off the train. The students proceed to get off the train, following the instructor's instructions. After all the students had gathered together, the professor started to explain about the evaluation. He said that, as stated previously, the third year's midterm exams will be a group task with random members. Each group would be composed of 3 students from the warrior department, 1 student from the magic department, and a supervisor. The professor then said that the group will have until Monday to complete the approved task, and wished best of luck to all the participants. Soon all the groups were announced. Andrias was worried as he read the list of all the members that would be in his group. He already knew that the academy had countless villains besides him and Sharon, and in this evaluation 2 villains were in his group. The first one was a player who had fought the cult and was called the fanatic Hazar Gapri, and the other was the academy's undiscriminating murderer, called Vivian the Lunatic. As Andrias read the names of the other members, he was still frustrated as to why 2 villains from the game were in the same group as him. As he thought about his luck, which was also of a trashy character, he was suddenly called by someone. He then turned slightly towards the one who called him. The stranger asked if Andrias had seen the photos of his team members, and proceeded to say he was Christopher, who was in the same group as Andrias. Christopher said it seemed like he was training as a warrior, even though he was a magician. This disgusted Christopher, and so he told Andrias to not get in his way. Andrias, surprised by Christopher's behavior, asked him why he was being so aggressive. Suddenly, all the other members of his team started to approach them. Hazar came towards Andrias, and Christopher waved his hand and introduced himself. He continued and said that being an unfriendly warrior was a big problem. Meanwhile, Andrias thought in the back of his mind that the fanatic Hazar had come. Vivian also introduced herself and thought these guys were crazy as Christopher and Hazar continued their argument. Christopher asked Hazar if he was saying that Christopher wasn't sociable, and that if he should leave a magician copying the warrior's training style alone. Hazar in response defended Andrias, saying he was fine with it, since everyone should get a little bit of physical exercise anyway. Their discussion was soon interrupted by the supervisor, who yelled at them to stop fighting. However, Andrias knew that they were not the only problem in this group, as they also had Isekai'd as their supervisor, who was more like a Yankee than a supervisor. All of this made him certain that his group was the worst ever. The evaluation instructor proceeded to guide the participants that they could go and get the requests once all the group members had gathered. He further wished the students luck and asked them to try and come back alive. Having 2 villains, a mob-like knight and a Yankee professor, made Andrias worried how he would clear the evaluation and come back with a group like this. As the train left the station, the Yankee supervisor formally introduced herself as Isekai'd, the supervisor of Group 9. Then, she took out the request form, showed it to her team members what they had been tasked with, and told them to look over it carefully. The request form was to investigate a village in Baron Balaric's territory. There is a rumor that the landlord of the village of Thrim has been murdered. An investigator who was sent 2 weeks ago had also disappeared, therefore requesting an investigation to be conducted by the mercenary guild. With a slight look of annoyance, Ivy asked her group members if they had any further questions. Meanwhile, Andrias was thinking she was much more aggressive compared to the game. Isekai'd, apart from becoming the youngest Aura Master in the near future, no more information was known about her character. Even though her skills were extraordinary, her personality would make things difficult. She started to mock Andrias by pointing at him, calling him a seaweed head, and how he has been trying to play a knight recently. Being a knight herself, found it as a joke as to how a mage like him could possibly be a knight. She further mocked him, asking if he could even lift. RMC wasn't someone who let others underestimate him. Keeping his calm, he sarcastically replied he didn't want to hear that from someone who needs to chew on jerky to keep her cool. Ivy, agitated by his response, said she couldn't smoke there, and if he wanted her to chew on him instead. Panicking, Hazard tried to calm down the situation and hoped they would arrive soon. They soon reached their first destination. It was Baron's castle. As they walked towards the castle, Ivy thought that for a baron, his castle sure was big. After they entered the castle, they met with Baron Boleric, the lord of the land. He welcomed everyone, saying they had come a long way. He continued saying how shameful it was that the incident had happened, but he would briefly explain the situation to them. The landlord of the Thrim village was his nephew. He was a baronet, but he had no family and concluded that was all the information he knew. Even though they looked unsatisfied, Ivy thanked him for the details he provided. All of a sudden, Baron's butler leaned towards him, calling him his lord. As he whispered in Baron's ear something about the young master, Baron suddenly had a worried look on his face. Andrias, being the curious one, was watching intently as the butler whispered. Observing their behavior, he was very suspicious of them. After hearing the butler, Baron had a troubled look on his face. Suddenly, he stood up, excusing himself that he had to attend to something and wished them the best of luck. After he left the room, his butler apologized for their rudeness, further stating that the young master was unwell. Ivy responded it was all right and they have got all of the needed details, so they would be leaving soon as well. The butler had a grim look on his face as he watched them leave. Meanwhile, as the group were leaving, Andrias glanced back at the butler. After they left the castle, they met Christopher and complimented him on doing a good job watching over the equipment. As Ivy unshed her sword, she stated how calm Baron was even though his nephew was missing, which made her confident that something was wrong. She called Andrias seaweed head and asked him if that was why he insisted for them to depart immediately. Andrias agreed to her statement and said that many things looked suspicious. Especially the part about the missing investigators who lost contact sounded like a fabricated story. It was also odd that they only sent one investigator even though a month had passed, but the most suspicious thing was the butler's attitude. As Andrias pointed these things out, Ivy reminisced about how the butler was trying to convince them to rest for today, and had even said if they left now they would probably reach their destination only by nightfall. Furthermore, he recommended that it would be better for them to leave tomorrow instead of today. Ivy, finding this suspicious, told the butler that they appreciated his concern but rejected his offer, as she refused by stating that their jobs came first to them. The butler looked displeased by her response. Andrias, seeing his reaction, he thought that the butler looked like his plan had failed. Above all, they looked anxious, their breathing, behavior, and trembling down to even their slightest gesture, which was clearly how someone would behave if they were hiding something. For now, they decided to get inside the carriage and head towards Thrim village right away. However, they were certain that there was definitely something more to this request. They knew that Thrim village was far away, and they had to reach before nightfall. So, the coach made the horses run at a fast pace. As they were going through the woods, Christopher suggested that they should get a place to stay first when they arrived. But Ivy, disagreeing with Christopher, said that the investigation was their first priority. She continued by stating that they would start by investigating the landlord's castle first. Meanwhile, Andrias was still suspicious about the whole thing, but all they could do for now was to check it out directly. Suddenly, he felt something around his chest. He was bewildered as to why his mana had suddenly started to shake. The sensation was getting stronger the closer they got to the village. Out of nowhere, the carriage started to shake and move at an incredibly fast pace. Everyone was surprised as to what was going on. In a state of panic, Christopher told Hazar to move as he opened the window and was about to ask the coach what he was doing. Before he could complete his question, he was shocked to see what was going on outside. The coach and the horses seemed unusual. They looked as if they had been possessed. The coach was wiping at the horses like they were monsters, and in turn the horses were screaming while drools came out of their mouths. The carriage was moving in an uncontrollable way much faster than it was supposed to. Christopher, as he witnessed this chaos, shouted Hazar that there was something wrong with the coach. Hazar, confused with his reaction, questioned what was wrong. Ivy was trying to analyze what the situation was as she was puzzled at what had happened. Without hesitation, she kicked the door with immense force, which created a huge burst. Everyone was amused to see Ivy's action. As the carriage was dashing forward, the door burst out, which was sent flying behind the carriage. As Ivy looked outside from the carriage, she realized that it was too late. Hurriedly, she looked back and told everyone to brace themselves for impact. Everyone was scared as Ivy further stated that they were going to crash into the main gate of Thrim village. They were trying to brace themselves by holding on to whatever they could. Suddenly, they crashed onto the gate, which made the horses fall down and the carriage destroyed, sending its wheels flying. As they were moving at an incredibly fast pace, The main gate couldn't withstand the force, which made the carriage slide towards the villagers near the gate. Because of the crash, the coach fell near the villagers, who were dancing in an unusual manner. The villagers' eyes were white, which looked like they were possessed, just like the coach and the horses before the incident. Everything in this village seemed weird, and even though this commotion had happened, the villagers paid no attention and still kept dancing like they were being controlled. As they were getting out of the carriage, they looked unharmed by the crash. This was because they were prepared for the impact. They then stood on the carriage. But witnessing all this, they were trying to understand what was happening there in that village. Andrias, along with his team, were in a state of confusion as to why all the villagers were dancing. The villagers looked like they had no control over their body. Even though they were exhausted and were drooling, they kept on dancing. Puzzled with all of this, Christopher called Andrias and yelled what was going on there, and what was wrong with the villagers claiming that a mage like him should know. Meanwhile, Andrias, in the back of his mind, was convinced that this was something more than just a mana anomaly. Grabbing his chest, Andrias concluded that the fact his mana was reacting meant that this was the work of a mage. But not an ordinary one, a mage who wields black magic and is powerful enough to control the whole village.